I believe it takes a lifetime to build a musician. Unfortunately, nobody has that time. Competitivity, education expenses, and also the desire to acquire quicker than the essence of the music from the soul, and of course the grammar, the skill. And the skill is something you can catch quite quickly if you have a good ear and you are very smart. And you can bypass with your intuition all what people consider the equation of life's experience, emotional, educational, the knowledge of your personal growth within the understanding of what you are involved in, humanistically and, of course, historically and contextually. Of course, these words sound discouraging for people who need to achieve early success to be competitive. And this, I understand, is a very difficult task to establish in trust with the young person, whether it be a child prodigy, a young person, or even a young adult. I think that some of the depth of what we are supposed to become reveals to ourselves itself more clearly after stumbling on other things, and the pre-ordered know-how that can be delivered effectively to the success for the person as well as the entourage, from parents to teachers, doesn't necessarily, but it could be, englobe the real care for the long-term development of this artistic being while budding, that needs to develop into a humanistic approach of what they will do. Naturally, without technique, they cannot do artistry. And artistry without technique would be only more theoretical or possibly more scholarly. And I think that the combination of the two, or the fusion of the two, is what I strive to translate, to transmit, to become, by my example, the meaningful purpose that a young person can search towards their own fulfillment of their artistic call. Nothing is to be duplicated naturally, that would be superficial. But there are things to learn about what we want to value in an artistic personality, creative, performing, or simply transmitting what the tradition was brought to them through the edition, the recordings, the teaching, and then what they make out of it, which is a beautiful chain of events, unfortunately, the maturation of which cannot be rushed, or if it is, could be caught up. The ideal way to look at things is to take every week, every day, with a beautiful task that is to explore, understand, and deal with. Let's say a prelude and fugue, by Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier, handwritten, hand-copied, and from memory, sung with voices for layering, played and eventually, if not sung, at least spoken, before to be played, but also played after having first been learned from the text, and not only from the hearing of the examples of others. In the daily practicing, to reach for a pianist independence of fingers, flexibility of articulations for the knuckles, grasping the weight of the natural dropping of the shoulders towards the elbows, and then the palm support in order to articulate the fingers without tension in the tendons of the wrist. Those exercises are daily. This exploration of the well-tempered clavier is weekly. Necessarily, of course, one could like to stay longer at each in order to fulfill it to its fullest, but life is full of things going on, not to mention education and schooling, and life itself. So I think it's wise to entertain a certain dosage of exploration that is weekly, and then come back to it after, let's say, if one has the capacity to pursue one's desires, the full cycle of the 48 prelude and fugues in 48 weeks. And then on a second or third run, go more in depth for those things that might not necessarily have been learned, because it takes time to go into the details and memorize them in the follow-up of the very thought of the composer. I like to say that this is an approach, could sound idealistic, but it allows a short-term progress, because there is nothing more discouraging for a young pianist, for example, than to practice when it's relatively easy to start in order of pushing the keys at the right place, compared to the pitch or the tuning that you don't have to produce, like in voice or strings or winds. And then this mother tongue that you learned has to be taught for its grammar. And this is what the playing by ear pianistically can reach early unfortunate glass ceiling. And so in order to avoid discouragement by the level and discouragement by the practicing loneliness repetitively of exercises, when you can on the piano reach quickly playing quality compared to other instruments which need more time to be established technically to produce the sound that lets the pitch. And then at the same time develop the capacity to enhance the inner search for the harmonic colors, for the voicing, to simply follow voices while practicing sequences on a keyboard. Being a musicologist or a pianist necessarily has different meanings, but the practicing of the technique for the fingers should be accompanied, I believe, I'm even convinced, by the capacity of understanding where we are in what we do. In other words, bring in the GPS in the flow of the practicing so that the repetitivity doesn't appear meaningless, but that you reach short-term goals in practicing. Of course, it would help to have a practicing coach, a controlling teacher of the progress or the regress, and to have also a coach, and to have somebody who teaches you also how to manage your own physical approach in terms of the tensions on the shoulders, the arms, and how to obtain the colors that you need to develop your tastes for, like taste buds, in order to be able to differentiate not only intuitively the tonalities or the harmonic progressions or the dissonances from the consonances, but to navigate within the thought process of the composer. And that helps a lot the performer to have written some of it from the score, because then you would have the time, not in real time when you have to place the hands and find out how horizontally no more, but vertically the two hands have to fit, and no matter how polyphonic the stems might be written up and down for each hand, one simplifies. There's no other option in order to place the two hands together, while when you write down, copy, or try to write it from memory, you isolate layers. You enter in the flow of the events of why this section comes after the next. If not why, at least how. And because of that curiosity, you develop a sense of awareness of where you are in the piece when you play it, in order to not appear as if you fakely composed it, because you didn't, but that you're able to learn the language of the novel in which you need to read the book in its original text. I don't say that everybody should learn all the languages of music, because there are so many, and that compared to the until 19th century, music was until then the music of the day. Today is the music of the many yesterdays. And we cover so many centuries of awareness of music, from its notation to its interpretation, or at least, even if on an instrument that doesn't correspond, to understand its gestural meaning, its symbolism, the intervals, the leaps, the organization of the pulse. In other words, be able on the same modern piano, if it were, to play pieces of different time periods or cultural entities, and define their sound scapes, and intelligently read the score's intention through the beautiful intuition of oneself, but also through the observation of all the notation, either from photocopy of manuscripts. Granted, ancient clefs are harder to learn to read from, or even from trusted editions, and regardless, to reach the point where you learn about the meaning in terms of its intricate construction of what you're trying to build when you play the piece, or the section, or the movement, or even a phrase. You have to establish the articulation through the breathing, which on the piano performance has to be intellectual. If it's compared to bowings or compared to breathing in singing, one has to have, imagination, but also experience of exploring the different ways and valuing the importance of a different direction of the line, would it be on 2, 4, 6, or 8, or 3, 9, 10, 12 bars. And not necessarily as a game intellectual one, which is to just remap the phrasing style system, either because you don't want to sound like the others for the purpose of it, which is vain, or because you just follow the flow of the intuition, in which case you don't question the tension releases that could reach a further release than the immediate one from the dissonance and consonance of raising drop. And how to bring that yearning into the intuitive musicianship of a student is a little bit counterintuitive naturally, because it goes against what you're supposed to do, because you have to rethink how you want to be persuasive in your articulation of the phrasing. In other words, your capacity of conviction. And all this has to be done with all kinds of allegories towards imaginary lyrics, if it helps. If not, to come to the point where you value the structure as an architectural gesture, as a beauty of a mathematical equation. Would it be symmetrical or asymmetrical, or the pulse, the phrasing, the melodic line or lines, the importance of secondary lines, or establishing some kind of hierarchy, other than just hearing how others have found it. And even if you listen to others, you can have a critical hearing, because you would have had perhaps the opportunity to spend some time studying the score, the notation itself, and then have a teacher help you translate the intention through the notation, which is not necessarily the distribution of the hands and the fingerings, which can vary, and of course you have to adapt to the morphology of each student's size hand. But the ultimate goal is to reach the meaningful arrival point of a phrase, after which you have a punctuation, and then go to the next phrase, other than only the number of bars, as the composer chose to notate the structure of the thoughts, while very often the phrases overlap the bar lines, and for far more than even the groupment of bars in hypermeters. And the problem very often when one evokes such analytical observation of the notation of the score, while intuitively guessing what the music is supposed to say, or perhaps for some genres it's impossible, because some styles also remain more difficult to guess than others by one's own intuition. So the analytical aspect, I think, should never supplant the, let's say, musicianship, the innate, but it should become coating, where you could have a discussion with yourself about, should I try this in this pulse, in this tempo? Is andante meaning leisurely walk, or do I have adagio, that means take the time at ease, or do I go to the phrase arrival point anyway, even if it's a tighter or looser phrase direction that might be lost on the way? The coherence of the interpretation is not necessarily the sum of the analytical understanding of it, but I think that it's often not valued when acquiring the skills and technique to play the notes in the right spots. And it's neither nor, it's both. And I find that when you bring the student to observe and I would say start to enter in the patterns of the thought process of the composers, development of the elements that are used, puzzling or clear, controversial or rethought. It necessarily is something that nourishes the inner world of the performer, in the sense that the performance, of course, can never be twice the same. Ephemerally, it all restarts from scratch every time you start the piece. But the awareness of the elements enters in fusion in the flow of the events of the piece. And so while you can be very attentive to details, you should always think about the meaning of what you're stating, so the macro within the micro. And all the micro things, while in place, don't justify the macro organization of the structure. And then the rubato and the phrasings, inclination, other than the notation of the rhythm, would it be by unmeasured notation, like grace notes or group of notes, or the sense of transitioning to another tempo, and how much to loosen up and how much to drive forward faster. These things are not necessarily like rubato, famously so, quantifiable or objective. They are very subjective. And so you have drawn a path through which you might take other lanes, but you know where it leads you, and you can let yourself rediscover the piece while you play. Sometimes it's dangerous because then you hear things you didn't perhaps hear earlier. It's like rereading a beloved book. You discover more and more elements that bewilder you, or perhaps even make you so enthused, but intrigue you. And you cannot be intrigued and play at the same time, because then you're lost. And if you're totally oblivious to what's going on and you just, let's say, perform the piece independently of the meaning which the piece brings to the listener or to yourself towards the listener, since you are, as a performer, your own listener, while actively performing, and with the recording option, you can listen to the amount of achieved goals of the different elements that you value in the piece, or you learn to value when you discover the piece and you practice the piece. So that's why I find it very humbling, because I learn from students' discoveries of things which I thought were already what they were supposed to be in that piece. And I don't go to a lesson with a prepared idea that I will just empty my knowledge on the student and they'll just use it as fuel for their own engine. I think that it's something of a mirror where our awareness and their intuition beautifully exchanges and humbly brings you to always rethink the piece anew, regardless how many decades you've known it. There's no hierarchy of time passing that should bring you to a point where you would feel like, because of your experience, you have a superiority on the people who don't have experience with the piece. I think it's useful to help the student to avoid a lot of the shortcomings that you had to go through. And that is, I think, a practical help. The fingering, the phrasing, the disposition of the hands, the organization of the thoughts about it, but not necessarily to lock in this way the vision of the piece or the practicing of the piece of the student. Rather be listening to what the student is yearning for. Of course, if you believe that is stylistically wrong, then you don't want to enter in any, let's say, controversial situations where they can tell you, I heard it by such and such played and I like it that way. And you could tell them, yes, but this is the visible part of the iceberg they're recording. What about all what motivated it? We don't have such always explanations, far from there from performers. We only have their final product of what their understanding and their performing leads to. And then we have musicologists who can then give us a description of their intentions and their realization. And of course, it's a very subjective point of view about who prefers whose interpretation. But ultimately, I think it's important to guide without to stifle, to respect and at the same time direct, but not necessarily instead of respecting. What is the budding necessity for the student to learn this piece? And I think that it's overly easy to just play like me. And it's very more important to help you play it like you. Because it's a long-term commitment. And most of the time, the teacher doesn't see the fruits of these seeds placed in the pieces, knowledge or learning experience by the student, because the student leaves to other horizons in their lives. And perhaps after several decades or whatever time takes for the human nature to absorb the different experiences that we go through and then express it through our art. That brings us then to compare it with different schools and different performers whom we value or some who we prefer to criticize. But I prefer to stay outside of that field and stay with the piece itself and talk about what we read on the score and how we read the score, how we hear the score if it were to speak to us directly from the notation. And then we are more free about our choices. And I find that guiding is also being very attentive to the students' yearning. And I personally I'm very impressed how many layers there are to a piece. Wisdom or intuition, knowledge, or just pure drive, and sometimes the quality of the interpretation doesn't have to be necessarily so knowledgeable. But I believe that it's not necessarily on the piece itself or on that very technique for the piece itself that you show the essence of your personality. It's by how you manage the transitions, the miscellaneous sections, or the sections that people consider secondary, or voices. In other words, what you value and how you organize that. And sometimes it's just intuitive and you don't know why. Sometimes it's because you have a name and it's a strategic plan that you'll do this and that at this point of the piece. Sometimes it's a bit of both, and sometimes the unexpected always happens in performance that escapes your control, no matter how much you've practiced it. And then you learn from this by experience, and then you go again through it. In a way, learning the piece is the step before performing the piece, which is the step before knowing the piece in performance in front of an audience, for instance, or a microphone, as a whole experience of going through the piece. And then only starts the awareness of the piece living in its artistic life through your own life's experience. And not that necessarily the earlier interpretations are weaker than the later ones, it's just they have different depth and not necessarily better. Depends of the genre and the style of the music. But generally, it is, as a philosopher says, the aim is the trip itself. And so you become aware of how much you enjoy discovering and rediscovering the piece, either because of a student or by yourself, or because intrigued by what a student heard, saw, guessed in a piece that you might have not in that very section, in that transition, or that modulation, or that repeat, or that not taking the repeat. There's so many aspects to the flow of the events of a piece that change with the way we hear it, we then manage to perform it with a loss between the imagination and the realization that has to be brought to the least by technique, repetitive practicing. And then, therefore, managing the unexpected in performance becomes almost as if you welcome it and you're not afraid of it. But you have to have such a quick concentration and capacity of intellectual flexibility to adapt on the spot with the unexpected that results from whatever reason made it result, whether it be technical or memory slip or something. I didn't go to plan. And so I find it very liberating when I see a student able to express themselves without to fear the mistake, and very attentive to avoid it by planning the right gestures that have to be planned ahead of time in order to avoid stumbling into it. So a lot is to do with planning ahead, just like a conductor beats ahead of the orchestra and the orchestra plays on the beat that the conductor is already pulling the score a beat or a bar forward. But by yourself, if you're the pianist. You can share it in chamber music, in accompaniment with song, if it's to do with text also. So you can interact at many levels, the music making itself, when by yourself, inevitably you have to be the conductor and the performers. And the lack of satisfaction of the elements achieved through the performance to their best is very discouraging for some. They'll say, I'll never be able to put all of these in the same performance, all these elements that have to be there in order to value the quality of it for the piece that I consider be that. And that's where it's important to encourage, I believe, the student to not give up, to not be satisfied, and at the same time to always go back to the piece itself to find the truth about the next step of the awareness of it. Regardless of the results of the competition or the misunderstanding of the interpretation because of some other performance that might have overtaken you with the meaning of the piece itself. And all these experiences, I think, teach the student to become themselves. It's not necessarily something that is linear, and sometimes that takes time to be visited after having been learned, and other pieces are learned, and then you go back to it again periodically, either because of an opportunity, an obligation, or your desire to develop the depth of this or that musical genre, style, composer, language, or evolving language of the same composer. Find ways to forget about the misunderstandings or misguessings because of the way that we approach a piece without to have its language codes in our intellect or our heart. And be humble enough to say, not I don't like it, or perhaps I don't understand it, but I will try again. And sometimes some pieces reveal themselves to us at different points of our inner growth, inner development as humans, regardless only as musicians in the case of a pianist, for instance. The intellectual, literary knowledge, the awareness of equations, of the desire to organize a structure that brings you satisfaction because of what you value in the piece. It always goes down to valuing what you discover that you love in the piece. And it's not necessarily only because you have let's say, in allegory, a teacher who would be an art critic who will make you see what are symbolisms in a given painting when you just look at it for what it is. But that doesn't mean that you like it more or less. I think you like it better. And perhaps you want to ignore some of the elements that you learn about it because they don't match with what you expect from it by your intuitive musicianship. And that's fine. Critical rejection is very healthy. And then you go back to it later or at some point. All these words might appear for those who listen to it as unachievable unless one has commitment and means and time and no rush to develop oneself until one reaches the plenitude of the different elements that one values in the music making. So that's why it has to be coordinated with the reality of life and the competitivity that is necessary for oneself, betterment, but also because of the fact that one doesn't exist on one's own and one needs to be constantly tested by competitions. And now the fairness and unfairness of the competitions is secondary. It's unfortunately painful, but factually, we need to know where we are standing, and sometimes the competitions give us disappointment or give us an impulse, or sometimes the discouragement reaches different seasons of our life when we are at different points of what is considered the established moment of an artistic maturity. From schooling to competitions to self-construction of all these awareness. And it can be painful when this is, unfortunately, far from being harmoniously synchronized. Sometimes one gives up and one goes back to it too late, or one doesn't enjoy it and does it without to understand why one does it. Again, it's always the problem of finding a balance between meaningful practicing, short-term goals, and meaningful fulfillment of the spiritual uplifting which the music brings to us beyond the technique and the awareness of its grammatical presentation. After all, the musical thoughts come to us notated for mostly centuries of dead composers that we have to decipher. Of course, now we have more editions than before, more awareness than before, more teaching experience than before, and more articles to read than before. So, if we are curious to be knowledgeable, and I won't replace, as I said earlier, the intuition, we can and we should. Now, of course, not everybody has the same level of commitment and capacity to make sacrifices towards situations of early professional success. But when the professional success occurs earlier than the maturation of the musicianship, then inevitably comes a point, perhaps later in one's life, where one has to reset and rethink the purpose and the means. And if one takes longer time to harvest all these ingredients and then develop them more in time rather than all squeezed in the same quick time, I think that then one reaches ultimately the goal of the meaning of it, which is to find who you are through what you're doing, from what you received, and what you become. And that is the long run of things, the decades of life. But inevitably, the acquiring of the technique and the acquiring of the repertoire and the acquiring of the awareness and how to practice and how to learn and how to memorize and how to organize the structure of the piece itself in one's ideal vision of the piece. This is, of course, in the more immediate future of any young student. I find that the teacher is in a position where you have to be very strict and very encouraging, not necessarily on the same levels. If you're very strict and very discouraging, you can toughen the student, but not necessarily allow the student to continue develop, because there has to be at some point, at some level, within the student, a form of, if not satisfaction, at least a goal towards the achievement of the inner beauty or the inner meaning, and not necessarily beauty in the sense of aesthetic beauty, but the meaningful beauty of the elements that we are given to serve musically. Such are my thoughts, because partly of the upbringing of mine, which was peculiar, and I don't believe it's necessarily even possibly duplicated, to be duplicated. But there are elements in it which are food for thought that can contribute to help the student become an artist and continuously develop their capacities and their own musical path towards achieving what is meaningful to them. Thank you.